Do I need this? Yeah, thanks. Martin set the table quite nicely for some of the things I want to say, but by comparison, I'm coming from a much different place in that as an architect and former artist, I look at this question of enduring buildings, durable buildings, from the vantage of the question of their meaning. And it is, after all, commonly referred to, in the US anyways, that the greenest building is the building already built. But why is it that buildings already built fall away from their meaningfulness? How is it that we can regenerate and create buildings that are truly resilient? And the hint is in the green lettering. I suggest to you that we have for too long been idealizing more pure buildings and I think more simply performance. 100 years ago it was function. Today it's energy and environment performance. But I believe that layered buildings and living cities is a great point to begin reflecting on how it is that creative thinking has to be truly deeply dynamic. Creative thinking has to be a part of the green building movement. So the unlikely source of this will become apparent in a minute, and I look forward to some vigorous questions on this topic. But I want to start as a professor from the perspective of the sources of meaning, where we know it comes from, meaning comes from. And we know that time is a generative meaning. We know that the relationships between us as communities, as individuals, create meaning. We know that the content, the ideas, the intentions we have when we conceive of and build buildings is a source of meaning. And we know that the values we bring to buildings generate meaning. It is the rich complexity of these sources that is of great interest to me. Historical significance is something that we now broadly and around the world appreciate and understand. The preservation and conservation of buildings, even their representation in identity pieces on the significance of a city or a place, the way in which cities revitalize and adapt themselves, all become important factors for the significance of the history of places and buildings. We now know as well that environmental health is critical. In this room, if we knew all that we were breathing in from the off-gassing of materials, we might not be quite so happy with ourselves and pleased with ourselves. And we're learning more and more about this. That's changing how it is we think about buildings. And there is a cluster of terms here related to environmental health that are really significant. Oh, look at the Y, escaped from the word agency. Anyway, you know, it's a funny thing when you travel to different places, the projectors calibrate differently and kick your letters around. That's kind of creative, I think. But the social agency, you mentioned consumers, you mentioned advocates. We now understand that deeply meaningful places do come from an awareness, a sensitivity, and engagement of the constituents and stakeholders. And cultural creativity, the sort of cutting, slicing edge of my talk, is also important, and we need to realize that this is a source of energy and a source of a resource that we actually don't know that well how to best use. And so I'm going to make a few arguments about that, about when to bring creative people into the process, how to use them, and how to help deepen and build significance in the environments that we're rebuilding. You'll notice that adaptation is the four terms that both spheres tend to thrive on, how it is that environments adjust. Martin again mentioned changing times and the dynamics of living cities. It is the creative response to these that, for me, is at the heart of all that's most important. Just quickly, I'm not going to dwell on this, but I have been interested in some time for how it is that time and changes our understanding, and again, we have some slipping lines here. Look at that red line, jumps out of position. But I have been studying at some length the relationship between pure preservation and pure destruction, and finding that in between all of these increments of influence on how it is we act on the world around us, it is, in fact, in that middle zone that some of the most exciting and some of the most promising and some of the most reality exists on our making and remaking the world and cities. I like to think, as a starting point, that places, buildings, things that we make in whole cities are really best thought of as having biographies, like all of us as living. And that there's a way in which places as having biographies are a point of departure and engagement that's really exciting. And you'll see I oppose my point of departure here. I look at the motivations and ethics that we carried so much through the 20th century about privileging in the modern era, the new, the complete, the stable, the proven, the clear, the durable. This was very much a part of the ethic of the 20th century. I like to argue that hidden in the 20th century actually was a surprising source of resistance and resilience, which was a whole series of art movements. That's the surprising part. Like, what the heck does art movements have to do with Green Building Council discussions? Well, I'm going to try to make a case. Usually, as a sources of resistance in cultures are the individuals that are marginalized. And through their marginalization, they tend to see and think about things that the mainstream doesn't. And when you consider that throughout the 20th century, there were a whole series of movements that privileged the sense of time, the incomplete, the fragmented, the ambiguous, the marginal, et cetera, it's an incredibly rich source that I have turned to and found great inspiration. So I'm going to give you a couple threads of this art movement, and then I'm going to bring it back into the architecture and show you how I use it to knit together high performance considerations, reuse considerations, along with a regenerative and meaning, production of meaning. These are some of the art movements that I turn to and have studied at some length. I actually have a book on this that's about to come out, how it is that we can look at these movements and glean from them insights and appropriate action on the world reflecting of them. And this is probably one of the most surprising slides that I'm going to share with you. On the lower left-hand corner typically is a set of terms that I'm using. Picasso and Duchamp were really early, had extraordinary insight into this, where they took waste and repositioned it to generate meaning, to show us that the things that we had classified as waste or no longer useful was just a state of mind. That you could, in fact, recombine and reintroduce and reposition works of sources of material to create works of art and works of great significance. Joseph Cornell did the same thing. He collected waste materials on the street, reframed them and boxed them, and created whole narratives and stories and views by, again, using and repurposing waste. Gordon Matta Clark, who studied architecture, had two parents that were artists, went out into the world and actually engaged and act on buildings that were slated for demolition in order to treat them as subjects, almost like archaeological subjects, to awaken in us that which they had to offer and that which, of where they came and what they were made of. And he further took sections of these houses that, again, were slated for landfill and distributed them and cut them and exposed them to art venues around the world. This is an installation in the Museum of Modern Art from a house in Niagara Falls that was on contaminated land that was a repositioning so that we could read, again, almost like archaeology, the significance that was there. Contemporary artist Alatsali from Guyana is an extraordinary example of an artist who has been hiring impoverished citizens in Guyana to create fabric out of waste, gum wrappers and the top of wine bottles, etc., and then exhibiting these around the world and amassing a huge enterprise of repositioning and making beautiful things that we have discarded and thought of as little value. The same with Kiefer, who's taken waste materials, refuse materials, and repositioned them with narrative and insight and significance. And the Belgium architects, Rotor architects, who have been collecting waste material and showing us that a material that has lived a life carries with it meaning. So my central theme here is that the collage and ambiguity and the enigmatic actually has a role to play in sustainability, meaning, and long-term value. And that a healthy city and city making is a living culture that is in perpetual evolution. And it's a re-embodiment process. And that when we think about this, it becomes much more adventurous, fun, and exciting to actually do good and achieve performance at the same time that you're making deeply meaningful places. A couple of the most classic figures at this for me are the Italian architect Carlo Scarpa, who in the middle of the last century did a whole series of projects that he brought contemporary sensibilities in alignment with medieval and Renaissance works and did some of the most stunning works of architecture that came purely from the adventure and curiosity of knitting uncommon things together. And the High Line is another good example in New York, the recreating of an extraordinary linear park through the lower part of Manhattan up through mid-Manhattan by just taking a vacated rail bed that was going to be demolished and got recreated as a linear park. This park has generated more wealth in New York than any single act, second only to Central Park. And it was about to be torn down. So I'm just going to use 4 simple projects with a proper amount of humility that I've chosen to do jumping scales and to reflect my own personal process of awakening in realizing that present in each of these commissions was the chance to look more deeply and discover the opportunities that lie dormant that I could easily have, and the clients could easily have overlooked if we hadn't been paying attention. And it starts humbly in a house that a couple had acquired. It was his grandparents' property, and he had come to us as architects to simply tear it down and build something. We do, by the way, also new buildings, but this was a challenge for us because they said that this house that was on that property, because the property was quite extraordinary, beautiful piece of property, had little or no value to them. And this was from a man who as a grandchild of this original owner, came to this house and had many fond memories. But he was prepared to say it was done, it was gone, it was no longer useful. Because this was back in, and you can see in '98, we had already adopted the idea that waste stream was important. So we at least convinced them to allow us to systematically take apart the house and reposition and properly channel as much as possible, as opposed to bulldozing it. And the idea behind this was that we would have a chance to study this house alongside with the owner, the new owner, former child that came to this house to visit his grandparents in summers, would have a chance to reacquaint themselves with those memories. So we took the house apart slowly. We basically proposed that we could use a substantial amount of it, believe it or not, even though it was the cedar shingles were deteriorated on the outside, etc. This sketch on the lower left came out of my sketchbook. Basically, the top you can see is a new jacket, a new insulated, highly insulated enclosed jacket, which basically was built on the bones of the original structure, which we had to also reconfigure on the inside. So we introduced these structural members to allow the suspension of the layer of history, if you will, inside the house. What was phenomenal about this was the result, which was a mixture of remnant fragments of the original house and its framing. And in the lower drawing, you can see our sketches. The red, they don't really read that clearly, I guess, on the screen, but the red lines are all the bones of the building we preserved, and the black are largely new walls and new enclosures and new windows. So you can see about 55-60% of the house was reconstituted, and these are the images of the reconstituted house, that inside the house, the finishes, a lot of the new finishes were the old bones of the building. What was really amazing was what we uncovered in the process, and some very strange details, like these arcs in the floor, which were the result of the grandchildren visiting, and the boys and the girls each visiting at their own time, at different times, of course, because young boys and young girls don't really like to hang out together in the same bedroom. They moved the beds back and forth. The girls wanted the beds in one that they could share. The boys wanted them separate. And over the years, they created these scars on the floor, which we lightly sanded. This became their dining room, and it's a very fond moment of embodying in the fabric of the new home the traces of old and historical action. On the lower right was the most stunning thing. There was a mantle on the fireplace that he had forgotten. You can see a couple little footprints. Those are his footprints as an infant, that his grandfather had set his feet into the wet concrete. And next to it, the dog. And these were covered by tile that we discovered by opening it up, and this then became the mantle in their master bedroom. But all of this would have been lost had we not slowed down the process and looked for these elements and then made them into the new house. And the new house is a series of layers of new and old knit together that is a much more deeply cherished structure than we could have ever created in a new design. This is when I started waking up, is in this very modest little project. From there, we went to a whole host of projects. One of them is the loft building that I live in Minneapolis. When I'm there, I live and shuttle back and forth between Washington, D.C. and Minneapolis. It was an old farm implements factory, John Deere farm implements factory, 3-story factory in the warehouse district of Minneapolis. You can see it had been evolved into warehousing and the like. The original developer asked me and thought it was best probably to just simply put in sheetrock walls and divide it up for hipster lofts. And the building on the left, which I can see is not very visible in high contrast, at least the language, it's a simple cast concrete floor, heavy wood timber, a roof, but higher than normal floor to floors, but not quite high enough for 2 whole floors. On the right, what we ended up approaching the building as was, because of, this is kind of an important point that I have to take into account here. The code restrictions for a residential building and shared open space in a residential building would have prevented this building to have an interior street, a large 3-story scale interior street. We advocated for that in the beginning as opposed to 3 double-loaded corridors. What we did was interrogate the codes and discover that we could knit into the body of the building a series of simple concrete block walls that aligned with the old wood structure and create 21 small buildings, fire-separated small buildings, nested within one building. And what that gave us was the freedom. That's the nesting process. You can see the basic concrete block went from 12s to 10s to 8s up through the building and essentially allowed us to build basically 20 townhouses, if you will, 3-story townhouses within the building. And that freed us up to create an interior street. These are the utility cores that feed the building, the new utility infrastructure, kitchens and bathrooms. But we were able to create a street that we sliced down through the middle of the building and brought daylight into. And that daylight allowed us to introduce interior windows and to create basically an interior gallery space with a set of freedoms. With the concrete block walls, the owners are free to treat these surfaces as they wish and to structure infinitely anywhere they want intermediate floors. So we created a realm of freedom and adventure inside the building and attracted residents that were interested in a creative culture. The central hallway, which is daylit above, you can see on the left, is also an art gallery. And every season, the art is changed within this, and the public space of the private building becomes an event 4 times a year. None of this was in the owner's brief. None of it. It came about through a series of efforts to ask questions and awaken the possibilities that this otherwise pretty sad building, which was probably slated for demolition, would have experienced. This is the theme that I'm after, that there is so many rich ways that these older buildings, and by the way, when I was brought from the airport, Eugenius took me by dozens of tired old Soviet-era industrial buildings, and I said to him, I want to come and run a studio here. Our buildings are beautiful. So this is the building I was thinking of when I did that. We took and cut out sections of the floor and used it almost like monuments and fragments out in the backyard. They become the theme of the garden, where you can revisit the history and evolution of the building, and yet inside some of the most striking and contemporary treatments and surfaces and materials are introduced freely by owners and the new occupants. I'm going to hit this on time, so don't anyone worry with timing. We had the great privilege a few years ago to work on a building that was quite a legacy building in American architectural history. This is a building by Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi. It was their first large-scale decorated shed. For those of you that know about the Venturi complexity and contradiction, thinking in the modern period, this building, which was basically a kind of dumb commercial building that got a lot of attention because he mannered and animated the face of the building simply with tile blocks. It was bought and donated to Drexel University for the home of the College of Media Arts and Design, and the faculty and students of the college were profoundly upset because the inside of the building in the upper right-hand slide was depressing. This is, modern American office, open office landscape, what appeared to be low ceilings, et cetera. So we had a great challenge to help make this a significant place for creative education enterprises. What we did simply, and this had to be really simply, it was a very tight budget. Like a scalpel, we cut the center north-south slice through the middle of the building and introduced on the right, you can see that purple zone, we introduced 3 floor heights of shorter floor height within a 2-floor, larger floor height area, so that we could adaptively reuse the building without losing floor area. So we added floor area in greater density to open up daylight that comes down through the middle of the building on a north-south slice, so that the open space connected the design disciplines and brought daylight in, but the density also created some dynamics on the inside. The result was a sliver of space, so it became an interior street connecting the front to the back, but we, of course, had to confound that quite a bit. What we ended up finding out was that, unbeknownst to most historians, that the facade of the building wasn't just arbitrarily assigned. It was actually decoding a whole series of building systems inside the building, HVAC system, et cetera. And we took the facade of the building and started to realize that the zone, the white zone, was the zone precisely that we had cut out, as if it had been asking to be cut out, with a yellow column down the middle of the facade, which was where the strike of daylight would come down through the new building. The HVAC units were codified on the facade, and we ended up reusing those and appropriating them on the inside. Basically, this center zone of the building became an enriched, volumetric expansion of a set of codes that were on the face of the building. And we ended up doing this in cooperation with Denise and Robert, who were still living at the time, and Robert has lost a lot of his faculties. But in any ways, the project result was quite extraordinary. We ended up also, because there was more program than there was space, we had to workshop with the faculty to accept smaller spaces. The top is the size of the office spaces the faculty were entitled to, and we had to convince them to take offices the size of the bottom so that we could create a cultural zone, a precinct within the building that would advance their agenda. And this zone became the invigoration, the commons on which the creative educational programs were built. This is the result. We ended up leaving we exposed the bones of the building, including all of the traces that the erectors and the steel suppliers had on it as part of the new narrative inside the building. This is the space. We basically cut apart and reassembled the steel in order to keep it in place. But you can see where we cut the steel, we left the traces of all of this, including the notes that the structural fabricators had left on the members of the steel, in order to let it be a teaching and revealing instrument inside the building. And we turned the shared and cultural life of the building inward, so that the reviews and the actions that are shared are very much a part of an inner culture that you can read from any floor to the other. Again, a pretty modest intervention, but one that completely transformed the building and was extremely well received and has won, quite frankly, a lot of recognition. The last project I have is, we're going to fly over very quickly, but we have jumped in scales. We had the good fortune of being asked to help a large landowner in northern Minnesota consider what to do on an area of land that was devastated by iron mining. It's in Chisholm, Minnesota, and we had the audacity to suggest that this was a net zero, potentially net positive community on what was essentially wasted land. There is a lot in here, and I know that I've hidden a lot of this, but there's a lot of research hidden behind this. We're just going to fly over it quickly, but I want to underscore the theme, which is when you take creative thinking people alongside deeply knowledgeable civil engineers and biologists and ecologists, you can actually do some amazing things. So this is an aerial view of the region in question, and these are the older iron mines that were cut fissures in the ground as they chased the iron down in the ground, and it's a high aquifer area, so these cuts in the ground filled with water right away. And this area that we are working on is this area right here next to the city of Chisholm. But this is the scale of the kind of operations that are continuing on the Iron Range, a hugely disruptive impact on the land. This is the state of Minnesota and the phenomena of why the Iron Range is up there. Some of the richest sources of iron in the world that help build both the auto industry and tall buildings throughout America. So it's got a great legacy in American culture, but ironically, its legacy in Native culture has been all but forgotten. So what we ended up doing was saying that this was sacred land for the Native Americans. It was a watershed that went north to Canada, south to the Gulf of Mexico, and east to the Atlantic Ocean. And you can see all the watersheds stemming from this area. And But the native story in America is a tragic one, to be sure. But we discovered that this same location where all the wealth for iron came from was the same location that the Native American communities were basically robbed of their great history. So we decided to treat this project as a new ground on which this great riff had been built. And we went back and used much of the profound thinking that was very much a part of the native communities in this area, and contrasted it and worked with the phenomena of land disruption, and we're working on ideas about how to reclaim. This is a series of images over a course of about 50 years, underscoring the harvesting of the wood, and then the excavation of iron ore, etc. It was an incredibly sort of violent process, if you would. But the result is a phenomenal, passive, beautiful place with these deep-cut lakes. And so this is what the landscape looks like before the water started filling in. I'm not going to go through any of this, but you know the logic, the whole background of the environmental movement and why this is so important. We use this to help educate others about why we need to change our practices. And we ended up centering on two. The Living Community Challenge, which is a new outgrowth of the Living Building Challenge, and the Net Zero, Net Plus. But we're basically gathering around a whole series of these environmental models and building a new vision for this community. Basically, it's a institution and a green enterprise zone that's intended to be a complement to the city of Chisholm in order to help invigorate and retain and restore the city itself, which is fallen on tough times. We're very early in the process. We've just got approved and funded our first solar array. It's a 20 megawatt array. The first project will be net positive, that will produce the energy to basically achieve all the lights and traffic lights and street lights of the city of Chisholm. And the process of envisioning what this is really for us an extraordinary rich one. And we're generating lots we're working closely with a number of folks who have innovatively worked with what they're calling e-generation. It's using organic waste to produce energy, et cetera. And this is maybe the biggest innovation was we're realizing that the waste heat from that which they use now to pulverize the iron ore into taconite pellets is in fact the waste material is perfect for heat sinks and thermal sinking. So we're building this soft disrupted ground underneath new development and storing summer energy and winter cold and using it off season. And we're doing it at almost no cost because they're recontouring the land anyways. So that's really all I have to say. I just wanted to highlight we've done a lot of research on this, and some of the guests here actually are working on projects that we've been studying. But the last phase of it will be housing, and we're using a series of standards and precedents that are proving to be quite wonderful. So that's my arc. So thank you.
Because we have questions actually. But thank you, Garth. And I believe that your idea about coming to Vilnius and making some buildings alive again in the Ujanistis district, that sounds very good. So we look forward to that. But we have, you see a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And we have the most popular one actually, with 15 people supporting it.
15? Oh.
Yeah, so I'll need to ask you definitely. And the question is, when demolishment and rebuild is actually more sustainable than renovation?
When does that occur?
Yes.
It's actually a great question. We have found that it's there is no precise and universal rule to this. That's one of the things I've been trying to suggest, and we've opened a whole practice, by the way, that is early consultancy with clients who are considering or own property that they're not quite sure what to do with. That before they try to make a decision, they invite us in to expand the considerations of what's possible. Mm-hmm. And most of the projects I'm showing you were not driven by a program. They were actually driven by an assessment of opportunities. And I think this is where we're missing our opportunities truly, to be upfront, expansive, and creative thinkers on the part of property owners.
Okay, thank you. We'll have another one.
Oh,
Okay?
not going
Because
to
it's
get
a lot
off
of
that
questions.
easy.
Yeah, just one more. It's also a popular one. So the question is by Evaldas. Who is playing the main role deciding to renovate the building according to sustainable criteria? Is it the owner, investor, or the user of the space? Or is it maybe
Again, that
governmental
varies, but
regulators?
when they hire us, they get advocates for
Yeah.
high-performance green buildings. But what we try to do is distinguish those objectives and criteria from the opportunities of generating value and new use. So the idea here is that it's like an alchemy, right? That you know where you want to go, you know basically what you have to achieve. Can you do much better than that? And every time we've looked at this, the answer has come back yes. And it's not just, you know, the heroics of creative designers. It's this conversation that occurs between owners, potential stakeholders, people who would be interested in the ideas, all coming together and affirming that higher and new value.
Okay, so sustainability is not just an idea for idealists, it's for the whole people, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so thanks again, Garth.